The room was louder than Marvin Gaye wanted it to be. That was always the problem with these industry nights. Everyone performing for everyone else, laughing too hard, talking too close, wearing their success like a second suit. The Felt Forum at Madison Square Garden on March 14th, 1972 was no different. The 14th Grammy Awards were in full swing, and Marvin stood near the back of the room with a glass he wasn't really drinking from, doing what he did best in crowds, watching. He had almost skipped it. 3 days before the ceremony, he had told his manager flatly that he wasn't going. Didn't elaborate, didn't argue about it. Just said it the way a man says he doesn't want to go somewhere. He's been forced to go his whole life. But the nominations were there, the album was there, and some quiet, stubborn corner of his conscience told him that what's going on deserves someone to show up for it, even if that someone had to be him. Across the room, Stephen Sondheim was doing the same thing Marvin was doing. Not the glass. Sondheim wasn't much of a drinker. But the watching. He had a particular way of standing in rooms like this, slightly turned, as if he was listening for something the rest of the crowd had already decided not to hear. His company cast recording was up that night for Best Score from an original cast show album. He already knew what winning felt like and what it cost. The Tony Awards the previous June had made that clear enough. Nobody introduced them. In rooms like that, the introductions only happened if someone needed something from someone else. What's documented is that both men were present that night. Two rebels from different worlds, each carrying the weight of a year that had changed the rules of what American music was allowed to say. What happened between them, if anything, lives in the space between the historical record and the imagination. But the imagination has its reasons, and sometimes it gets things more right than the record does. To understand why these two men belonged in the same room, even if they never spoke, you have to go back to 1971. Not to the awards or the sales figures or the reviews, but to the specific suffocating feeling of sitting across a table from someone who controls your livelihood and hearing them say that the thing you made is wrong. Not bad, not unfinished. Wrong. Too much. Too honest. Too willing to make people uncomfortable. For Marvin, that table was in Detroit, and the man across from it was Gordy. Motown's founder looked at the finished masters of What's Going On, 11 tracks, fully orchestrated, every note exactly where Marvin had decided it needed to be, and told him it wasn't commercial, too political, too spiritual, too fragmented to market as a single experience. This was not a creative note, it was a business verdict. Gordy wasn't trying to make the music better. He was trying to make it safer, and those two things had nothing to do with each other. Marvin sat in that meeting and didn't raise his voice. People who were there remembered that. He didn't argue in the way the moment seemed to demand. He just looked at Gordy and told him, quietly, that if Motown didn't release the album exactly as it was, he would never record for the label again. A bluff with no bluff in it. A line drawn in the only place Marvin had any real power, inside the music itself. Gordy released it, and Marvin turned out to be right about something the industry had been wrong about for years, that a black man in 1971 making a concept album about war, pollution, poverty, and God was not a liability. It was a prophecy. What's Going On sold 2 million copies in its first year. Every critic who had echoed Gordy's skepticism had to quietly walk it back. But Marvin didn't celebrate the way people expected him to. He had given something enormous to make that album exist, and winning the argument didn't give it back. Sondheim had fought a different version of the same war. When Company went into production, the notes from producers and backers were relentless. Make Robert more likable. Give the audience someone to root for. Don't end the show on a question mark. People need resolution. They need to go home feeling something that has a name. Sondheim sat through meeting after meeting with people who understood the economics of Broadway, but not the emotional logic of what he was building. He had a way of going silent in those conversations. Not polite silence, the silence of a man who has already finished thinking and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. The central argument was about the final song. Sondheim had written a number called Happily Ever After for the end of the show. Cynical, funny, and bleak in the way that everything in Company was bleak. The cast told him it didn't work. Not because it was badly written, but because after 2 hours of watching Bobby hold people at arm's length, the audience needed one moment of genuine wanting, one moment where he actually reached for something. Sondheim went home and came back with Being Alive. And Being Alive was the most honest thing he had ever put on a stage, which is saying something, because honesty was the only thing Sondheim had ever really been interested in making. The lyric moved from resistance toward a kind of open-handed surrender. Not happiness, not resolution, just the willingness to feel something real even if it broke you. The Tony voters gave it Best Musical and Best Score. The conversation moved on, the way it always does, but the song remained exactly what it was, which was the point. Both of these men had spent the previous year making something their industry had tried to talk them out of, and both of them had refused. That refusal never looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like stubbornness or arrogance or an artist who doesn't understand how the business works. What it actually is, from the inside, is the knowledge that the true version lives in your head and that releasing a compromise is the same as releasing a lie. Marvin knew that what's going on had to be experienced as a whole or not at all. He knew that the groove had to breathe, that the songs had to bleed into each other, that the silence between the tracks was as much a part of the music as the music was. Nobody at Motown thought in those terms. They thought in singles, they thought in airplay and radio formats and demographic targeting. Marvin thought in something older than all of that, something closer to a sermon or a confession or a letter to everyone he had ever lost. Sondheim thought in specificity. He had a word for it, and he used it the way other composers used melody, as the primary tool. The wrong word was always worse than no word. Vagueness was not a style choice, it was a failure. Every lyric he wrote had to be the most exact possible version of the feeling it was trying to capture, because an audience could feel the difference between a lyric that was almost right and one that was exactly right, even if they couldn't explain why. That precision was what made Company feel like surgery. Uncomfortable, necessary, and impossible to unfeel once it was done. Here's what's strange about the way history treats 1971. It remembers the victories without really accounting for what the victories required. What's Going On was groundbreaking, yes. A conceptual masterpiece from an R&B artist signed to a pop factory, absolutely. But before it was any of those things, it was Marvin Gaye sitting alone in a studio after his friend Tammy Terrell had died, after his brother Frankie had come home from Vietnam with the look of a man who had seen something he would never be able to describe, and turning that grief into something people could hold in their hands. The fight with Gordy was almost incidental. The real fight had already happened somewhere quieter, in the hours between midnight and dawn, when Marvin had to decide whether to make the true thing or the safe thing. Sondheim had his own version of that quieter fight. By the time he was making Company, he understood the mechanics of the American musical more thoroughly than almost anyone alive. And he was using that understanding to dismantle assumptions the form had been built on. That audiences needed to like the protagonist, that love stories needed to end with love confirmed, that a song's purpose was to make people feel better rather than feel more. He was using the rules to break the rules, which is the hardest thing in any art form, because the people enforcing the rules are usually the ones writing your checks. At the Felt Forum that night, What's Going On took home Best R&B Song for Mercy Mercy Me. The Company cast recording won Best Score. In the larger culture, both of them had already won the argument that mattered, the one about whether music had to be comfortable to be great. But if you watched either man in the room that night, you wouldn't have seen triumph. You would have seen something more complicated, the particular expression of a person who has been right in a way that cost more than they expected, standing in a room full of people who are celebrating the outcome without knowing the price. What would they have talked about if they had talked? Not technique. The distance between R&B and musical theater was too wide for that. Maybe about what it felt like to make something true in an industry built on approximation, about the loneliness of hearing something fully formed in your head and fighting for the right to make it real, about what you do after you've won, when the noise dies down and you're left with whatever you gave away to get there. Marvin might have asked how Sondheim managed the internal voices, not the producers or the label executives, but the ones inside. The ones that said you were being difficult, that the version in your head was a fantasy. Sondheim, precise and unsentimental as always, might have said something about specificity being the only answer. Make the thing exact enough, true enough, and the doubt can't find anywhere to stand. They were not the same kind of artist. They never would have been. And the gap between their worlds was real in ways that went beyond genre. But in the particular year of 1971, they were doing the same essential thing, insisting on the full version, the true version, the version that couldn't be made easier without being made wrong. One of them used a voice that could make a chord change feel like an act of prayer. The other used a lyric that could make a rhyme feel like an accusation. Different tools, the same refusal. The Felt Forum emptied after midnight. The industry moved to its after-parties. The next morning, the reviews would be printed, and the records would keep selling, and the world would continue the work of deciding what these two men had made and what it meant. But none of that was in the room at the moment the ceremony ended. In the room, there were just two people who had spent a year being told they were wrong and had turned out to be right, and were now standing in the particular silence that comes after you've proven something to everyone except yourself. That silence is the part nobody writes about. The industry celebrates the win. The critics analyze the work. The historians catalog the influence. But the artists carry the silence, the one that settles after the fight is over, when you realize that winning the argument doesn't answer the question that started it. Marvin would carry that silence for the rest of his life. Sondheim would channel his into the next show, each one more precise and more unsparing than the last. They were in the same room that night. That much is true. Everything else belongs to the space where music lives. Not in the documentation of what happened, but in the feeling of what it meant.